Hey guys, welcome back to Beyond Dafeet. In this video we're going to go over a bit of tech talk, shoe lingo, all that kind of jargon you hear us talk in most videos, and just simplify it for you guys, kind of picking up a few words that you have no idea what they mean. I'm just going to break it down into this video and just make it a bit more simplistic, and hopefully you can use a bit of shoe or tech talk and all that jargon with some of your mates. First off, we'll get started with foot types. There are a few different foot types. Three different categories are your low arch, medium arch, as well as a high arch. So most of your high arches are either neutral or they do supinate, which means roll out. Don't have a high arch statue here to show you, but a lot of depth underneath that arch between the ground as well as the height of the arch, and then the instep is basically the height of the midfoot. So usually someone with a high arch ends up having a high instep just because there's quite a lot of depth to that midfoot area. Someone with a medium height instep usually ends up having that medium height arch or even a low arch, and these are either a neutral stance or they do tend to pronate. They can be neutral or mildly or severely pronate. On this channel you won't really hear us talk about overpronation or even underpronation. Underpronation is basically false terminology. It is called supination, so you can't really under roll in. It just doesn't make sense. So yeah, underpronation, the correct terminology for that, if you see any podiatrist, is supination. So people with that higher arch that I just mentioned are more likely to supinate. It will either be neutral throughout their stance, whereas that kind of medium height arch, people can tend to supinate, but mostly they'll either be a neutral stance or they will pronate, which rolls in. Then you got basically on that low arch side, most people with low arches end up having that medium height instep, so that from the ground to the top of their arch is kind of that medium height, or people with a low arch end up having kind of a low instep. So very shallow foot, similar to myself. I do have a low arch as well as a low instep, and I do moderately pronate, so I do roll in mostly on my right foot, and it is mostly at that forefoot section. So with pronation as well as supination, it can happen at 3 stages throughout the gait cycle. Not a whole lot of people pronate at the rear of the foot. Most of the time you see the pronation happen in either that midfoot section or the forefoot section. So I personally on my right foot do severely pronate on that forefoot section and end up needing a slight bit more guidance throughout my shoes, as well as even an inner sole. So high arch usually end up having a high instep, and with that high arch person, they are more suited to a neutral shoe, even something that is a bit more suited for a supination. So something like your Clifton is a slight bit more built up on that lateral side. We'll get on to lateral and medial in a second, but is a bit more built up on that lateral side, so it does kind of accommodate for a nice guidance throughout the gait cycle. If some person does supinate, it just puts them a bit more into that neutral stance and spreads the body pressure over the shoe quite evenly, instead of just wearing out that lateral side quite a lot if they do supinate a lot. Clifton 7, if you are someone that does supinate, will work brilliantly for you, even if you do have a neutral gait cycle. And with the medium height arch as well as medium height instep, you kind of have the most range of options when it comes to shoe choices, depending if you are neutral throughout your gait cycle or if you do pronate or supinate. So you've got a very lot of choices. There's a lot of options on the market. It just depends how strong your foot is and how flexible your foot is. If you do have a bit more flexible, weaker foot, probably push you into something that is a bit more stable. If you do have a slightly stronger foot, I'd probably look at it something that's got a bit more flexibility, whereas it doesn't limitate the joints too much. And if you wanted something like a speed workout shoe, if you do have quite a strong foot, I would push into something with that slightly bit more flexibility, so it doesn't lock the foot or joints up too much. Then moving on to someone that does have quite a flexible foot, you very rarely find someone with a low arch or low instep having quite a strong foot. Since the tendons and ligaments in the foot are usually quite longer, you end up needing that slightly bit more stability throughout your gait cycle, since most of the pressure could be on the inside of the foot, but you don't want too much at the same time. So there are shoes on the market that are probably too stable for a lot of foot types, especially having a low arch as well as low instep. Since it didn't have a stability shoe, for a good example, the 860 version 11, it is quite a shallow shoe throughout that midfoot as well as forefoot, and does have that slightly bit more guidance throughout that medial side on that rear as well as midfoot. Doesn't have a whole lot of forefoot pronation stability in this shoe, but is a good rear foot as well as midfoot pronation as far as the shoe goes. And with having a higher arch as well as a higher instep, you do need a shoe that does accommodate that. So you need a shoe that does have a lot more volume throughout the foot. So a perfect example of someone that does have a high instep and you're looking for a shoe that does have a decent amount of volume throughout that midfoot as well as forefoot section, New Balance 880 version 10. So it does have a non-gusseted tongue, so it is a detached tongue. It's got a ton of volume throughout that midfoot section, so it's not going to cut off any circulation to that midfoot or even just end up getting numb toes. And you do have quite a bit of depth to that forefoot section there, so accommodates the high instep very nicely. Nice solid lockdown on that heel, and just basically a ton of cushioning underneath the whole foot. So with neutral shoes, most of your brands do basically just have a single element. Some brands do have 2 elements of cushioning when it comes to the midsole. New Balance 880 version 10 does use 2 cushioning elements. They've got the Fresh Foam X and just a True Fuse top lay. With a high arch neutral shoe, or even someone that does supinate, you do need a ton of cushioning underneath your heel as well as your forefoot, since that is where most of your pressure is going. Good example as well, your Hoka Clifton 7 does have a ton of cushioning underneath your heel and forefoot. It does have a 25mm stack height underneath that forefoot, so very good cushioning system, and if you do have that higher arch, is suited to you. And getting onto tech talk a bit, so we'll move on to the meanings of medial and lateral. So medial meaning inside or middle, so anything on that arch side of both feet, so obviously inside of your right foot as well as the inside of the left. And lateral meaning basically the outside, so anything running down the opposite side of medial is your lateral side. You won't really see much change in the shoe on the lateral side. Not a lot of brands basically change anything on the lateral. Most of the technology when it comes to stability shoes, even some neutral shoes, are on that medial side. So with the New Balance 860 for example, they have that medial dual density posting. So with dual density, there's a different durometer. So that's a durometer meaning the density of the foam. So obviously the piece that is the supportive piece is a slightly bit firmer than the different cushioning systems in these shoes. So New Balance 860's midsole is made up of 3 different components in the midsole. So you got your Fresh Foam X top layer, your True Fuse, and just a slightly bit firmer bit of True Fuse on that medial side. So 3 different components when it comes to the midsole. It's just breaking down the outsoles as well as midsoles as well as uppers that brands are doing nowadays. Different brands do have different outsoles as well as different amount of rubber as well as rubber compounds when it comes to shoes. So XT900 carbon rubber that the Triumphs by Saucony uses is a very durable rubber. You're going to get a ton of Ks out of these. It's quite sticky even in the wet, and there's just a lot of forefoot grip. As well as a decent bit of high abrasive. You're not going to see any excessive wear when it comes to the outsole. This is a very durable outsole, comparing it to the Kinvara. So both these are neutral shoes by Saucony. Both of them do use the same rubber compound when it comes to the actual rubber. So this has XT900 in the heel zone as well as the push-off zone, but it's got none in between. So it just uses their Power Run midsole, but you're not going to expect the same life out of both these shoes. So you Triumph, you look about that 1,000 kilometers or about that kind of 650 miles, whereas your Kinvara, you probably look at about that 500 Ks or 600 Ks or about 350 miles. So you're not going to expect the same life out of both these shoes, even though they are neutral shoes by the same brand. The weight of the rubber is basically the biggest factor when it comes to trying to reduce the weight of shoes. So the Kinvara 11, substituting a lot of that rubber out makes it for a lighter shoe, but then again it kind of detriments, you're not going to get the same durability out of both of them. So that is kind of your lightweight daily trainer. A lot of brands are doing them, but durability wise, if you want something that you don't really kind of swap out after a few hundred Ks or even a few hundred miles, you want something that does have a bit of a decent outsole. Looking on the outsole as well, there are neutral as well as stability outer soles. So with something like your Brooks Beast, got a ton more rubber on that medial side, especially on that forefoot. So with most people that do forefoot pronate, you do want a slight bit more of a kind of pronation support when it comes to that outsole as well. Since most of your stability in shoes are from your midfoot or your rear foot, there's not a whole lot of shoes that do that kind of forefoot pronation, so most brands are accommodating that when it comes to the outsole. So a bit more limitation on that flex groove at that medial side on the forefoot, so it just helps on that late stages of that gait cycle on the push off. You're not pronating or severely pronating and just wearing out that medial side quite a lot. And looking at the rubber compounds, so there are kind of 3 stages of rubber compounds. Your Vibram do quite a lot when it comes to the running shoes, mostly of them are trail. So you've got your carbon rubber, which most brands do have their own kind of version of it. Your New Balance uses the endurance carbon rubber. Your Brooks uses, I think it's basically just called carbon rubber or SPR. And your Saucony use XT900, which I just commented on. And Saucony did use basically their crystallized rubber. They used it in the Triumph just prior. They've gone back to that carbon rubber. It wears a bit better and a bit better in the wetter weather. And they did use crystallized, so this was quite a high abrasive rubber. It was quite slippery in wet weather, so you only really could use this in dry weather. And with that kind of on the inside of that forefoot, they did use their crystallized rubber, so it made it a bit more stickier. Yeah, most brands do have their different rubber compounds. Your air-blown rubber, talk about it in a second. So with your 880, these are a prime example with most kind of neutral shoes by most brands, how their outsoles are made up. So you got your carbon rubber in that heel zone, and your midfoot zone is that air-blown rubber, so slightly bit more softer rubber, so it kind of increases the cushioning instead of just having a carbon rubber outsole, which would be a bit more unpleasant underneath the foot. So in those high abrasion spots, you do have a more durable rubber, makes for the more durable shoe. So, yeah. Then most of your lightweight daily trainers, they do eliminate a lot of their rubber, which basically decreases the weight of the shoe. It does decrease the durability that you're going to get out of the midsole as well. Now, moving on to midsoles, these are basically where each brand gets their own gist from. So most of these shoes nowadays are going to a 1-piece midsole. Some brands still do 2-piece midsole, then some other brands do 3 or 4-piece midsoles, which kind of gets a bit hectic, and there's a lot of adhesive which adds up making more weight in the shoe and ends up being, yeah, there's more things to go wrong. Brooks themselves, plus a few other brands, are doing co-molding technology nowadays. You're able to inject different densities or durometers of foam into a 1-piece midsole. So prime example of co-molding is the Brooks Go 13. So this is a 1-piece midsole, but it does have 2 different durometers when it comes to the cushioning. So you've got Brooks's DNA Loft, which is their softest cushioning ever. So that wraps on that lateral side of the shoe. Then on the medial side, you do have Brooks's Biomogo DNA. So you've got 2 different cushioning systems making up in a 1-piece unit. Saves a lot of weight when it comes to adhesive. There's less stuff to go wrong, and it actually makes up for a sleeker shoe. Smooth transition between both cushioning systems ends up being a bit more pleasurable instead of just having a kind of a harsh adhesive there just to split it up. So most of your stability shoes end up having quite a few more components in the midsole, a few different durometers when it comes to the cushioning systems, and a few different kind of foreign objects, we'll put it that way. So with your 860, I just touched on it, has 3 components. You got that fresh foam X true fuse, as well as a slightly bit more durable, slightly bit more of a firmer true fuse on that medial side. With the Asics Kayano 27, this is probably the most components when it comes to the midsole. Ends up making that midsole a slightly bit more stable, since it is a stable shoe. It's just their kind of take on a highest cushion stability shoe. So you got your flight foam Propel on that top sole, and ends up making up the whole forefoot cushioning system, which is a great cushioning system, the flight foam Propel. And on the underside of the flight foam Propel, you do have just normal flight foam that ends up turning into Dynamic Duromax, which is their stability system. And then you got your gel on that lateral side of the heel, as well as your trussic underneath. So there's a lot of different components in the shoe. There's a lot of adhesive, making it a slightly bit more of a heavier shoe, adding all that adhesive in, as well as a few different components. But that is Asic's way of making up a stability shoe. This is probably one of the most sold shoes in the world, if not the most sold running shoe in the world. So they're definitely doing a good job, and this is definitely one of their better high cushion stability shoes. The flight foam Propel is definitely dialed in compared to last season, and it actually makes for a good shoe if you are either this foot type, so that low arch and low instep, or even the medium instep or a medium height arch to low arch. So this is made for that someone that does pronate, has a slightly bit more flexible foot, a bit more of a weaker foot. Just nice throughout that step, having a lot of support on that medial side, as well as the heel counter being quite stable. When it comes to the Kayano 27, you do end up having quite a lot of people that do have a high instep as well as a high arch in this. And that ends up kind of working for everyone. This is catered for someone that does have that low arch and low instep, or a medium instep as well as a medium to low arch. And moving on to kind of the new age technology when it comes to shoes. So most brands are looking at a thermoplastic or a thermopolyurethane, which ends up being a more durable cushioning system over the life of the shoe. Your Powerrun Plus by Saucony, they ended up kind of introducing this after everyone. Your thermoplastic beads by Adidas, the Boost, was basically the first brand that kind of had a good way of doing it. They haven't really innovated since then. But your Powerrun Plus is probably the best thermoplastic cushioning going on the market at the moment. Nice and durable. It's basically all beads, it adheres together. Sinks in very soft. The durometer is quite soft, but also the rebound as well as the durability is quite decent. So you're not getting any of that kind of slugginess after that 300 Ks. The density of the midsole doesn't change too much since it is a thermoplastic, so it doesn't degrade in any kind of climate, whereas most traditional EVAs will end up kind of softening after about 300 kilometers, whereas your thermoplastic just stays well. It doesn't really care what kind of climate you run in, and it just holds up very nicely. You get that kind of same softness that you had in the first 100 Ks, and you'll feel it again in the kind of 500 K mark. With the thermoplastics, you'll see it in quite a lot of the carbon running shoes. It is quite flexible. With that energy return, you need something that is quite flexible, something that does have a bit of shock absorption in it. While we're still on midsoles, we'll look at stack height. So stack height is basically the thickness of the midsole. So basically from the ground to the top of the midsole, or to where basically your heel sits, as well as your forefoot sits. And with stack height comes drop or offset. So with this Clifton here, has a 5mm drop, and the stack height of it is a 29 to 24. That's where your stack height and offset come basically hand in hand. With the stack height of the 880, I'm pretty sure it's a 30 to 20, so this does have a 10mm offset. And with the Kinvara, I'm pretty sure this is a 28 to 24. So this is a 4mm offset, so makes for not a whole lot of difference between the heel as well as your forefoot. Brands like Ultra basically have a 0mm drop. You've got basically the same amount of cushioning at your heel that you do your forefoot, which activates the Achilles more, as well as your calf, but we'll save that for another video. Yeah, probably a thicker stack height on the market of both these guys. I'm pretty sure they're both around kind of 33mm at the heel. The Hoka may be a 34, but you've got a ton of cushioning under these when it comes to the midsole, and yeah, this has an 8mm drop, whereas I'm pretty sure the Bondo runs with a 4mm or 5mm drop, so slightly bit more of a lower drop, which makes for a lot of forefoot cushioning, but it can end up being a bit more cumbersome underneath the foot. Stack height, basically the height of the cushioning system, and offsets the change of height from the heel to your forefoot. If you guys want any more information when it comes to stability shoes, or even just high cushion neutral shoes, we did do 2 separate videos on that, so if you are wanting a bit more of an in-depth look at your stability range, click on the link just here, or if you want a bit more of a breakdown of your high cushion shoes, it's a slightly older video, but it's still relevant. There's a click on the link here. But yeah, you do have external as well as internal heel counters. Most brands are kind of doing their own thing. A lot of brands are changing to an external heel counter, so it makes the heel counter on the inside just be a bit more cushioned. You're not going to get that feel of that you have a plastic heel counter behind you. But with having that external heel counter, it can sometimes feel like you're not getting the same grip on the back of the feet. Both of these external heel counters, you've got your 880 as well as your Kano. These do a very nice V-shaped heel, so you're going to get that secure lockdown even though they're an external heel counter. With most of the other shoes on the bench, they're basically all internal, so you still got a nice firm bit there, not as much cushioning on that inside. With the Triumph 18, you still do have that internal heel counter, but there's still a lot of plushness there. But it's a slightly bit more of a U-shaped heel counter, so you're not going to get that same lockdown V-shaped feel that you will get from something like your 880. Now moving on to your uppers, most of your neutral uppers, there's not a whole lot of things that go on with them. You do have basically your 3D printing around your eyelet chain. Most of them just have a nice breathable mesh. There's not really any stability aspects in there. Mostly when you come to your motion control shoes, you will have a bit more of that reinforcement on that medial side when it comes to the uppers, so it just saves that bit of pronation as well as supination. So on the Echelon by Saucony here, there is 3D printing or just reinforcement there on the lateral side as well as the medial side, so makes it someone that does have a bit more of a hypermobile foot, so someone that does supinate as well as pronate. Just secures that midfoot section there as well as the heel counter, makes for quite a stable shoe even though this is a neutral shoe. And with your Asics base, they do use a functional logo, so you basically see this on all their shoes. So these two strands that come up on that medial side, they do join to that eyelet chain, so just keeps that midfoot quite nice and secure, and just does kind of accommodate stability in the upper, as well as kind of working hand in hand with their stability system in that midsole. So most of your brands, when it comes to stability shoes, do that. Even on your Bondi as well, similar to your Echelon, you got your 3D printing around that medial side, as well as a 3D print around that lateral side. So hugs the foot nicely, you're not getting that instability in the shoe or instability upper, and the durability of that 3D print just doesn't make it wear as quick as basically just all being that nylon mesh. And what I touched on before with uppers as well, the 880s as well as Kinvara is kind of a prime example. So both these are neutral shoes, but someone with a high instep may end up having a bit more trouble getting the shoe on, since this Kinvara does have an attached tongue, and it is quite a shallow fit when it comes to the depth of the shoe, whereas your 880 does have a lot of depth to that forefoot as well as midfoot. If you do have that high instep or just quite a bit of volume to your foot, you're going to slip into this guy a lot easier than if you do end up picking the Kinvara up. This is quite a shallow fitting shoe. With volumes of shoes, you do have basically attached and detached tongues. Detached tongues, you're going to get a lot more depth to them, since there's not a kind of constriction on the sides or something that's trying to make it shrink back down and kind of hold the foot. Most brands are going to the gusseted tongue and using kind of a neoprene elastic, so it does stretch nicely. The Clifton 7 does have a gusseted tongue now, so it hugs the foot a bit better. So you're not going to get that tongue slipping down to that lateral side, keeps it centered, and just kind of saves any friction happening on that instep. So if you guys have got any questions when it comes to shoes or foot types, let me know in the comments. I'll be willing to answer them. I did touch on saying that these were basically suited for stability shoes, but it does kind of depend on yourself. I personally have this foot type, and most of my shoes I run in a neutral shoe. It's something that's worked for me. I do use an inner sole in all my shoes. My shoe at the moment is a Clifton 7, so this is quite a stable neutral shoe, as I touched on with the Echelon. So there's not a whole lot of torsion throughout that Clifton 7 at all. It is quite a guided neutral shoe, and if you do chuck an inner sole in that, it ends up being quite a stable shoe than quite a few stability shoes on the market. So you can easily be more than happy. Even foot strengthening can be a thing. I would see your physio or podiatrist when it comes to that, since they have a bit more knowledge about your foot than I do. Foot strengthening can be a thing. It's just if you do have a long ligaments or even long tendons, it is harder to strengthen them than if they are shorter, if someone does have that higher arch. If you do have these two foot types, you have that lower or medium height instep as well as the same arches. You can still run in neutral shoes, and vice versa. If you do have a high arch, you can run in a stability shoe, but they're just kind of targeted at what they are. So this kind of foot's targeted at a slightly bit more of a stable shoe, as well as these. Same with that medium height arch as well as inset. These guys do have a variety of shoes to choose from. Just depends on the strength of your foot, and just kind of how high that arch is, and just personal preference when it comes to how strong your legs are. Then with your high arches, most people do have that stronger foot, so there's not a whole lot of flexibility with the foot either. So they are kind of prone to just end up being in a neutral shoe. If someone does have quite a immobile foot, I would suggest something a bit more flexible, since it doesn't lock the foot up at all, and just guides it throughout the gait cycle nicely. We do have videos on stability shoes if you want to click on that, as well as videos on neutral shoes. Gives you a bit more in depth on how they kind of compare to each other. That's basically me rambling on shoes. Hopefully it's clarified a few things for you, makes the videos a bit more interesting to watch, and you can easily pick up on a few things where I was saying. Yeah. Just one of those ones. If you made it to this far in the video, hit the subscribe button as well if you haven't already, and keep up to date with what we're talking about. See ya.